We'll move on to chapter 9, which is the chapter about cellular respiration. And each of these chapters, metabolism, cellular respiration, and photosynthesis, more or less build on each other. Not so much there's cellular respiration and photosynthesis, but in learning about cellular respiration, it'll help you grasp the information about photosynthesis, because they are two sides of the same coin. They're both ways that photosynthesis is done by autotrophs. Cellular respiration is done by heterotrophs, but they're both ways that living organisms get energy, create energy out of something that's outside of itself. In terms of photosynthesis, the source is light. When it comes to cellular respiration, the source is going to be organic molecules that other living biological species have created and stored energy in themselves, otherwise known as we have to eat plants, or we have to eat something that ate plants, and that we have to get our organic nutrients elsewhere. All living organisms require energy sources from outside of themselves. Remember the laws of thermodynamics. We can't just recycle all of our own energy. We are open systems, and in an open system we are always losing heat. So every time we do something catabolically or anabolically, and particularly catabolically we're going to lose heat, anabolically we need additional energy to do anything anabolically. Energy flows in the ecosystem, as you can see. Sunlight, things come in as an energy source from sunlight, back out via heat. And we're talking about heat given off, whether that's macro heat, whether it's the heat that you're given off, that you give off with regard to keeping you warm, or the heat of your individual muscles, or the heat that is given off just in this process of cellular respiration. Then the other side, there are many ways to think of photosynthesis and cellular respiration as two sides of the same coin, because photosynthesis generates O2. We give off CO2. So photosynthesis generates oxygen. Cellular respiration generates carbon dioxide, which plants use to make and store the stored form of energy, which is glucose. Now, please understand, the stored form of energy in plants is glucose or starch. Our stored form of energy can be glucose or fats, or fats with regard to a carbon with hydrogen bonds on it, which, think of those fats, those long carbon hydrogen tails. That's all very stored energy there. So when we talk about cellular respiration, we use sugar or glucose as our template, but it isn't the only thing that can go into your energy producing cycles. The chemical energy that's stored in organic molecules are used by our cells to create ATP. ATP is what powers work. So ATP is what's going to make the flagella move. ATP is what's going to cause your muscles to contract. So the organic molecules are used to generate ATP. And then several processes are central, and we will look at, they're basically cellular respiration is broken down into three basic processes: glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain. The pathways of ATP production, so catabolic pathways, breaking down organic molecules to form ATP, can be done aerobically. So it can be done in the presence of oxygen. This tends to be the more efficient pathway, this is what cellular respiration is. It produces far more ATP than anaerobic respiration, and it consumes compounds other than O2, and we can think of fermentation, which is a form of anaerobic respiration. Now, some organisms are, as we learned, are anaerobic in nature, so they're adapted. They're very good at creating energy in the absence of oxygen. It just so happens that we are not one of them. But certainly yeasts. You think of bacteria. What we have over here on the side is where you start out with glucose. Again, our poster child for these pathways that we're talking about, breaking down into pyruvate and then forming the lactic acid that creates soy sauce. And this is in a process of anaerobic fermentation, cheeses and yogurts, beer, wines, and bread, when you think of yeasts with regard to bread. Then carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are all consumed as fuel, but here's where I'm making the statement that almost all the discussion so far going forward will all be about glucose. Please understand that there is a pathway for fats to go into most of these cycles, as well as proteins to be broken down and go into most of these cycles. And what you have on the right is this concept that we breathe in oxygen, out CO2, and that the CO2 is a waste product of cellular respiration, as well as water, and oxygen is needed to actually fuel this cellular respiration. So we talked about glycolysis. We talked about, or I mentioned, and I will talk about, three processes: glycolysis, which takes place in the cellular membrane, in the cytoplasm. The Krebs cycle, which also is called the citric acid cycle, which is called the TCA cycle. It has three names. I will apologize in advance because I will continually call it the Krebs cycle because that's what it was called when I went to school. And then the electron transport chain. These are the three processes we will discuss, and each of them are part of the creation of ATP that's used to generate to do work. There's another term on here that will be referred to often, this oxidative phosphorylation, and that is the process of going from ADP to ATP. So actually putting that that phosphorus on, and then this putting the phosphorus on, which is a less stable molecule, henceforth has the ability to create energy. The way that organic molecules are decomposed or broken down is by this transfer of electrons. And so that's a little simplistic, but that's the piece of it we want to look at right now, this transfer of electrons. Electrons are those negatively charged particles that are orbiting around the positive nucleus of whatever element we're talking about. And the one that is the most useful for organic molecules is hydrogen. It's one of the reasons why fat molecule creates so much energy, because there's so many hydrogen bonds in a fat molecule. Remember, visually try to think in your head, you have multiple carbons. You can have 20 carbons, and each of those carbons are going to be able to have at least 2 hydrogens attached to them. Remember 2 because in a long chain, one of those, carbon makes 4 bonds. 2 of those bonds will be attached to the next 2 carbons in the line, the carbon before it and the carbon after it. And so each of those carbons is going to have 2 hydrogens. That's a lot of hydrogen bonds that can be broken down to release energy. In terms of fat, the same thing is true with glucose, which is the one we'll talk about. And then this idea of oxidation reduction reactions because this is the way that these reactions have to take place. If we're going to transfer an electron, the electron is going to be taken from something and given to something. And that's what this redox is the transfer of an electron from one reactant to another. And that is called an oxidation reduction reaction. We shorten it into redox. Oxidation is the loss of electrons, and this can be ionic reactions, that RXS is just short for reactions, or it can be the loss of a hydrogen atom in covalent reactions. And remember, carbon mostly likes to bond covalently, so most of the reactions we're talking about here are going to be covalent loss. So we are referring to an entire hydrogen atom and looking at its electron going into the electron transport chain, and that means we have a positive hydrogen ion floating around somewhere, and so we'll talk about that. So remember, with covalent reactions, it's mostly you're looking at the entire hydrogen atom, which will be one proton, one electron. Reduction is the gain of electrons or the gain of a hydrogen atom. So this is a definition of these two terms, and the idea of oxidation reduction, the best way to remember it, and everybody does this, is this mnemonic to the side called oil rig. Just remember the terms oil rig and the image oil rig. Oxidation is losing of electrons, reduction is gaining of electrons. So when we are asking what was oxidized, we want to ask ourselves what lost electrons. If we are asking ourselves what is reduced, we want to say what gained electrons. And then furthermore, because we don't have enough to learn yet, something that is capable of reducing a reactant is called an oxidating agent. Something that is capable of oxidating an agent is called a reducing agent. And so the release, and I hope I just said that properly, I think I did, the release of energy is ultimately used to synthesize ATP. So if we look at our famous glucose molecule, C6H12O6, plus oxygen, so the glucose becomes oxidized, it's losing hydrogen, it lost a whole lot of hydrogen, and with that, those hydrogen ions, remember the hydrogen atoms, remember you have a positive and a negative, and then the oxygen becomes reduced because it's gaining a bunch of hydrogens plus energy. More about the oxidation redox reactions. The picture on the left, on the right, is rust. That's a redox reaction. Remember, that's one that is spontaneous, although very slow. And then you have a ionic oxidation reduction reaction, which most of the time our organic molecules are going to be covalent. But in this hydrogen chloride, the chloride is reduced, therefore is an oxidizing agent. The sodium is oxidized, therefore a reducing agent. So think of it as the chloride is something that can gain the electron. So reduction is gain. So chloride can gain that electron, gain that negativity, therefore it's an oxidizing agent. Remember, oxidizing is loss. So it's kind of a, I would be very honest with you, it's kind of, you have to think about it for a couple of seconds to make sure you're in the right space with this. And then sodium is oxidized, therefore it's a reducing agent, and then you have a nice visual here that might help you put this into your head, particularly methane gas. We'll pick this up on the next one.